Chairman McMillan, and you spoke about the younger generation not being in trapping. It's we're feeling that in the license sales too. I mean, it's just attrition is killing us all. So, but thank you for coming. Moving on to the Fisheries Committee, Chairman David Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'd like to call Dave McKinney, Chief of Environmental Services, up, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Committee Chair Watson, Commissioners. It's been a while since the agency has visited the issue of contaminants in fish. I'm pleased to say we haven't had a great deal of reason to do that in some years, but this is a good opportunity to have a conversation and perhaps answer questions that may come up. Recently, the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation issued a precautionary advisory against consumption of black bass, that smallmouth, largemouth, and spotted bass, in the Big Sandy embayment of Kentucky Lake. Big Sandy comes in river left just south of Paris Landing. So it's in the northern part of the lake, downstream portion of the Tennessee portion of the lake. A precautionary advisory advises that high-risk groups, women who are or may become pregnant, nursing mothers, and children not consume fish, and that others limit consumption to one meal a month. The advisory that has been issued is for mercury specifically. And some years ago, in the early 80s, the General Assembly modified the state's Water Quality Act to invest the responsibility and authority for issuing advisories, and the term in the law is posting, to advise the public, in the Commissioner of the Department of Environment and Conservation. And so it's important to notice that not only does the commissioner have the authority, but he in the law has the responsibility. Tennessee has a great deal of expertise when it comes to contaminants in fish. We have been working on this issue since the mid-60s, and most of this work has been collaborative between what is now TDEC, TWRA, the Oak Ridge National Lab, and TVA. And so we keep abreast of the latest contaminant information, the latest analytical capabilities. Our labs share and split samples for quality control purposes. The state's first advisory was actually on the North Fork of the Holston River, and it was for mercury. This was for mercury that came out of Olin Saltville chloralkali facility, where they were separating the chlorine from the sodium, and they used mercury in that process. That was significant amount of contamination in that system, and it's still there. I have printed out and given you a list of the advisories to date. It's what we handed out earlier. And these advisories are printed in our fishing guide on page 36. We want to be absolutely transparent with the public about making informed decisions. The state has long experience with organic contaminants like dioxin, chlordane, dieldrin, PCBs in particular. Commissioner Cannon, that was a huge issue and still is on Fort Loudon Lake and on Watts Bar. Mercury is kind of behaves a little differently than some of the other contaminants. There are sources of mercury like the chloralkali facility in Saltville There was one in Alabama that actually sent its old reactor vessels, concrete vessels, up to Tennessee, and people were using them as small bridges. That's where the advisory on Beach River comes from. That concrete was just saturated with mercury, and so we are in the process of identifying and removing all of those bridges. Advisory numbers for mercury is an issue here because the Food and Drug Administration and EPA have finally gotten on the same page. And what you see for mercury that is not from an industrial source is that it comes from atmospheric deposition. And when it falls in areas that have water resources with low oxygen content, like wetlands and really slow systems, like the Big Sandy watershed, that the mercury goes through a biological process. It's called methylation. It becomes more bioavailable and tends to concentrate in the food chain more quickly. A couple of things that are converging here are that EPA's and the guidance numbers in the mid-60s, it was 1 part per million mercury. Sometime later in the 80s, they revised that down to 0.5 part per million, and about 8 years ago, they revised that down to 0.3. In all the monitoring we've done across the state, we knew that there were black bass populations that had bounced around below the 0.5 who now got caught by the 0.3. And that's a fair number of the advisories that you see here. So you see a convergence of several things. One is the atmospheric deposition continues to this day. The analytical capabilities have improved greatly over the last 20 years. You can detect mercury now in fish down to parts per quadrillion. And I will say that there are no fish in this state that don't have a detectable level of mercury in it. Even the trout, wild produced trout up in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. If you get low enough in the detection scale, you will find traces of mercury. So the analytical capability, the continued deposition of mercury, and then just the epidemiological information that keeps building up, that keeps driving down this number, saying that mercury is really a serious issue for high-risk groups. The issue has come up for this particular advisory, and it's drawn attention because Kentucky Lake is such a fabulous resource. And to my knowledge, this is only the second advisory on Kentucky Lake, the first being Beach River, which there was an identifiable source. So a big concern is about crappie. What about crappie in the Big Sandy area? Well, we have looked at crappie across the state where there are contaminant issues for black bass, and they simply don't concentrate contaminants in the same way. It may be that the muscle structure of the black bass is so much more dense than it is in the crappie that's part of the issue. But we have agreed to address that question with TDEC, and we will be sampling crappie from the Big Sandy embayment this spring, and we will be making that information available to the public. The issue has come up about, well, what about the catfish? And here, as you look through the advisories, just consider that organic contaminants like dioxin, dieldrin, PCBs behave much differently than the heavy metals. They tend to concentrate in the lipid or the fat portion of fish. So if you're looking for organic contaminants, you're going to look at the catfish. They're going to be the very best indicator of whether or not you have an issue. For heavy metals like mercury, totally different situation. That contaminant concentrates in the muscle tissue, and so across the board, black bass. If you're looking for mercury issues, that's where you're going to look. On Big Sandy, an interesting issue has come up in that there are a lot of tournaments in the northern part of Kentucky Lake, bass tournaments. And by some estimate, at any given time, maybe a third of the fish weighed in on a tournament at Paris Landing come from Big Sandy. And then they are turned loose all back to the main reservoir. So people are wondering whether or not the fish they catch in the main reservoir, if there's a concern. And I want to thank Tim Broadbent and all the folks in Region 1 and Frank Fiss and Bobby Wilson, others who have weighed in on this. I get to talk to you about it, but it's a team effort. There's good indication that if fish are brought out of Big Sandy and returned to the lake, the main part of the reservoir, that they are such a small percentage of the overall population of black bass, it's really not an issue. Combine that with the fact that healthy fish will disperse, and about 40% of them will go back to where they came from, and unhealthy fish are going to eliminate themselves from the population but post-tournament mortality pretty quickly. So we don't think it's an issue here. But it is something we might visit with the tournament folks. I mean, easily dealt with, return those fish to Big Sandy. So that's an issue that our fisheries folks can give, and Region 1 can give some further thought to. I did want to say that Tennessee adopted this approach to issuing advisories, and the agency has been a part of that through the Valley-wide Contaminants in Fish Flesh project since the early 80s. There is another approach that New York adopted years ago, and they said, you know, we are not going to try to keep up with all of these advisories and changing numbers and different contaminants. We're just going to issue a blanket advisory. No one should eat more than one meal of fish from any water in the state. Tennessee opted years ago not to do that because there are so many places where we think contaminants are not an issue. But as the numbers change and the number of contaminants change, then the state may revisit that sometime in the future. So with that, I would be pleased to try to answer questions that may come up.
Any questions from the commission?
Yeah, I don't know whether, I hesitate to say it because this is, you're probably the only one here, or maybe Harold understands this, but, excuse my skepticism, but, you know, the EPA is pretty typically overreaches when they set minimums and maximums, and in my dealings with gasoline and fuel, they prefer that the land be like it was when Adam and Eve walked the earth, and anything past that is contaminated. So once a month, I mean, if we've got, and I see there's several down in West Tennessee and in Shelby County that do not eat fish. Well, seriously, I mean, we've got people that are eating those fish daily. So why do we allow fishing if it's that big of a problem? What are we overreaching with the warnings, or are we negligent in allowing people to fish and eat the fish?
You ask hard questions, Commissioner.
Just going a little accountability on your part and see
Well,
what we're talking about here.
You know, in the presidential debates, if you can't answer the question, you turn and attack the man to your left.
Go for it.
That would be such a poor idea in my case. A couple of things come to mind. One is some years ago, with the first advisory on the North Fork, and Commissioner Watson and I were talking about, is that it was illegal to keep the fish. And the agency enforced that guideline. We actually arrested people who were keeping smallmouth bass off the North Fork. And that turned out to be just a poor way to do business. And so we opted to put out information and let people make an informed decision. And that's why we reprint these advisories in the fishing guide. And the human dimension folks who have studied contaminant issues are fairly clear since the 70s that for an advisory you have three distinct groups. You have a group that hears the name of a contaminant and that's all they need to hear. They're never going to eat those fish. You have a larger group that says, I've eaten those fish all my life, they don't hurt me, and so I'm going to keep eating them. And you have a much smaller group that's going to make an informed choice and say, well, you know, I'm beyond the age of consent. I will eat these fish, but I won't feed them to my children. With regard to the issue of whether or not EPA is overreaching or not, you know, this is an issue where the states kind of go with where the authority to issue guidance comes from. And it's the Food and Drug Administration and EPA. They are now on the same page. And we certainly don't have the wherewithal to challenge all of the epidemiological data that they bring to the table to issue these guidelines.
What does, of course, bacon causes cancer, but I'm eating bacon. So, on the page here it says boiling, baking, grilling provides additional risk reduction. The next sentence is these risk reduction suggestions do not reduce health risk related to mercury. So, does it help or not?
That statement is in there, and it goes to the issue we were talking about of how contaminants behave as they concentrate in fish. Organic contaminants like dioxin, difuran, chloridane, dieldrin, PCBs are in the fat or lipid portion of fish. If you grill those fish or broil them and allow that fat to drip away, then in theory it takes some contaminant with it. Since mercury is concentrated in the muscle tissue, there's no cooking method that affects the amount of mercury in that muscle.
Do you think deep frying fish in oil actually is more dangerous than the chance of getting mercury poisoning?
As long as
Just go ahead and attack Chad, okay? Yes.
I'm going to need him much further down the road, so I'm not going to do that.
Any other questions from the commission? Any from the audience? Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.